At 67, after 4 decades pressing flowers between the pages of library books and selling delicate pressed flower frames from my small south side Atlanta porch, I never imagined my son Daniel would sigh with relief when a sudden summer storm kept me from his garden-themed wedding at the Piedmont Park Conservatory, as if my absence spared his new life the embarrassment of a mother who still smelled of soil and old stories. That morning, I had risen before dawn, just as I had every day since my husband Raymond died in a warehouse collapse 15 years earlier, the memory of his final phone call still echoing in my ears, his voice calm as he promised to be home for supper, unaware that the roof would cave under a misplaced forklift. I wrapped the rare moonflower vine I had nurtured for a decade in damp moss, its roots cradled in the hand-painted pot I had glazed myself in the community center kiln, the cobalt blue swirling with white like the night sky it was meant to mimic. The buds were tight-fist, time to open that very evening under the reception lanterns. A gift I had planned since Daniel announced his engagement, whispering to the vine each midnight as I misted it with rainwater collected in an old coffee can. I pressed my only good cotton dress, the pale green one I had worn to Daniel's college graduation, the hem still bearing a faint grass stain from the campus lawn where I had sat alone after the ceremony, watching him pose with Claire's family while I clutched a paper cup of punch. I pinned my mother's tiny silver brooch at the collar, an heirloom shicked like a violet, its petals worn smooth from generations of worried thumbs, and checked the bus schedule 3 times because the city had rerouted everything for road work on Cascade Avenue, the same stretch where Raymond's accident had snarled traffic for hours. The sky cracked open just as I stepped outside, rain slashing sideways, turning the clay soil of my front path into red rivers that swallowed my sensible black flats. The bus never came, the cab company laughed at the flooded streets, and by the time I paid a neighbor's teenage grandson $20 to drive me in his rattling Civic, the windshield wipers fighting a losing battle, the ceremony was over, and the string quartet was already packing up their music stands. I slipped through a side gate to avoid the photographers, shoes ruined, hair plastered to my neck like wet seaweed, clutching the moonflower like a child. And that was when I heard Daniel's bride, Claire, murmuring to her bridesmaids behind a curtain of hydrangeas, "Thank goodness the rain delayed her. Can you imagine those dusty pressed frames and her endless tales of raising him on food stamps, cluttering our aesthetic? Better she arrives now when the important pictures are done." The words settled in my chest like wet earth, heavy and cold, each syllable a pebble dropped into still water, rippling outward to touch every sacrifice I had never named. But I smoothed my dress, lifted my chin, and walked into the pavilion with the calm I had practiced for decades when customers haggled over a $5 frame. The same calm that had carried me through food stamp lines and parent-teacher nights when Daniel's shoes had holes. Daniel saw me across the crowd and ran over, arms open. "Mom, I thought the storm swallowed you." And I hugged him hard, breathing in the expensive cologne that had replaced the drugstore soap of his teenage years, a scent that spoke of boardrooms and bonuses, while Claire approached with a smile that stopped at her teeth, saying, "Florence, what a shame you missed the vows. They were so poetic." I kissed her cheek, tasting foundation and nerves, and answered, "The important thing is you are married now. May every year bloom brighter than the last." And if my voice trembled, only I knew it, because I had learned long ago to swallow earthquakes. The reception unfolded like a carefully curated magazine spread, all white linen starched to knife edges and cascading orchids flown in from Hawaii, the kind of flowers that cost more per stem than I earned in the day pressing violets at the flea market. Their petals so perfect they looked plastic until you touched them and felt the fragile give. I found my name card at a distant table with cousins I barely recognized, their faces blurred by years and distance, while Daniel and Claire held court beneath a floral arch that must have taken a team of designers a week to assemble, wires hidden beneath moss and baby's breath, the structure glowing under string lights like a cathedral of wealth. When the gifts were opened, the MC announced each one with theatrical flair, a crystal vase from Claire's parents etched with their monogram, a weekend in Napa from Daniel's firm, complete with a private vineyard tour, and then my moonflower, Lifted briefly from its pot by a waiter in white gloves, Claire turning it once, murmuring, "How sweet," before setting it beneath the dessert cable where the caterer's shoes would crush the lower leaves, the pot tilting precariously against a tower of macarons. No one noticed the tiny tag I had tied to the stem with embroidery floss, "For Daniel and Claire, may you grow old together under the same moon," because the photographer had already moved on to the couple cutting a cake frosted with edible gold, the knife glinting under flashes that lit the room like lightning. I watched Daniel laugh at jokes about hedge funds and private schools, topics that drifted over my head like clouds I could no longer name, his teeth white from the whitening strips Claire had bought in bulk. And when the band struck up songs I had never heard, electronic beats layered over strings, I waited on the edge of the dance floor for my son to claim the mother-son dance we had practiced in our tiny living room when he was 10, his small feet on mine as we swayed to an old Aretha Franklin record. He never came. At 10:30, with the party in full swing and Claire's father toasting their future condominium in Midtown, describing marble countertops and a concierge who knew their coffee orders, I kissed Daniel goodbye, said I had an early order to fill from Mrs. Jenkins down the street, and he hugged me absently, already turning back to his new circle, his hand lingering on Claire's waist. The cab ride home smelled of wet vinyl and exhaust, the driver humming along to a radio station playing songs from my youth, and I sat in the dark replaying every moment, the crushed leaves, the quick dismissal, the way Claire's friends had glanced at my simple dress and then away, as if looking too long might stain their silk, their eyes sliding over me like I was part of the furniture. That night, in the quiet of my small house on Lyndhurst Drive, the walls still holding the echo of Daniel's childhood laughter and Raymond's off-key humming while he fixed the leaky faucet, I placed the moonflower on the kitchen table, its pot leaving a damp ring on the oilcloth I had sewn from feed sacks in 1985. I watched one brave bud open anyway, its petals unfurling like a slow exhale, the fragrance filling the room like a memory that refused to be buried, sweet and heady, reminding me of the nights I had sat on the back steps with Raymond, sharing a single peach while Daniel slept inside, the vine's ancestor a cutting from my mother's garden in Macon. I thought of all the years I had risen at 4 to press violets before the school bus came, my fingers stained purple as I arranged them between dictionary pages, how I had sold my own winter coat to buy Daniel art supplies when he dreamed of being an architect, the coat a hand-me-down from Mrs. Delgado that still smelled of her rosewater. I had taught him to read the language of petals, that a wilted stem could be revived with a slanted cut and warm water, the same way a broken heart could be mended with patience and time. Lessons learned when Raymond's overtime checks barely covered the mortgage after the factory cut hours. I remembered Claire's prenatal brunch where I had brought a tray of lavender shortbread, the recipe my grandmother had used during the Depression, and she had smiled tightly, saying, "Florence, we're doing gluten-free now," as if my cookies carried the weight of every hardship I had never complained about, the tray left untouched while guests nibbled on kale chips. I recalled the time Daniel, at 16, had begged me to stop selling at the flea market because his new girlfriend's mother shopped at Whole Foods, and how I had quietly moved my table to the church parking lot instead, telling myself it was for his happiness, the church ladies buying my frames out of pity at first, then love. I thought of the Christmas when I gave Daniel the down payment money I had saved for a new porch roof, the tin patched with duct tape after every storm, watching him hand it to Claire for her wedding venue deposit without a backward glance, his eyes bright with plans for a future that no longer included Sunday dinners at my table. I remembered the Sunday dinners where I cooked collards and cornbread while Claire photographed the plates for her lifestyle blog, but never asked for the recipes, and how Daniel had stopped eating seconds because his new trainer said carbs were the enemy, pushing away the bowl with a polite smile that cut deeper than refusal. I thought of the baby shower where I arrived with a handmade quilt stitched from scraps of Daniel's childhood shirts, each square a memory of a school play or a scraped knee, only to have Claire thank me politely before folding it into a drawer marked linens, as if it were too humble for the nursery's neutral palette of grays and beiges. I recalled the night Daniel graduated college and I stood alone in the back of the auditorium because his firm had bought the family seats for coworkers, and how I pressed a single daisy from the campus lawn into my program, a silent keepsake of a moment I was not invited to share. The daisy still tucked in my Bible beside Raymond's obituary. For the first time, I wondered if the story I told myself, that love meant constant giving without counting the cost, had kept me small while the world grew large around my son, my sacrifices becoming invisible threads in the tapestry of his success. The next morning, I did not water the porch begonias I usually sent to Daniel's office when his stress climbed, the pots I had painted with leftover house paint to match his firm's logo. I did not text good morning with a photo of the sunrise over the backyard peach tree. I let the silence settle like dew on the leaves I no longer tended for him. On the third day, my neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, asked why the porch looked bare, her voice carrying over the fence as she hung laundry that smelled of sunlight and bleach. And I told her I was resting the soil, turning the phrase over in my mind like a new seed. On the seventh day, Daniel called, voice rushed with the static of downtown traffic. "Mom, the atrium plants at the firm are dying. Can you come look? The designer we hired used the wrong soil pH." And I said I was sorry. I had a prior commitment to deliver frames to the senior center. There was a pause long enough for me to hear traffic through his phone, horns and sirens blending into the soundtrack of his new life. Then, "Oh, okay, maybe next week," his tone carrying the same disappointment he had shown at age 8 when I couldn't afford the field trip to the aquarium. I hung up and enrolled in the Savannah Botanical Workshop I had circled in the community college catalog for 3 years, the one that required a week away, overnight stays in a dormitory that smelled of pine cleaner, no cell service in the greenhouse where the glass fogged with breath and chlorophyll. I told no one, not even Mrs. Delgado, who would have worried about me traveling alone at my age. I packed my grandmother's flower press, its wood darkened by a century of petals, a change of clothes folded into the same suitcase I had used for Raymond's funeral, and the moonflower vine wrapped in damp paper towels, its roots protesting the journey but refusing to die. Before leaving, I walked the house room by room, touching the pressed flower wedding portrait of Raymond and me that had hung in the hallway since 1978, the cracked frame Daniel had promised to replace when he got his first bonus, but never did, the glass spider-webbed over my smile. I left it crooked on the nail, a small rebellion against the perfection he now chased. I wrote a note from Mrs. Delgado asking her to water the porch pots once, taped a $5 bill to it with the same tape I had used to mend Daniel's teddy bear when he was 5, and locked the door behind me without looking back, the click of the latch sounding like a period at the end of a long sentence. I left my flip phone on the kitchen counter, screen cracked from the time Daniel dropped it at age 12 while trying to take a selfie with his first skateboard, and took only the prepaid burner I had bought for emergencies, its minutes untouched for years, its plastic case scratched from sitting in my purse beside grocery lists and church bulletins. I slipped a single moonflower seed into the coin pocket of my purse, the way some women carry emergency quarters or aspirin, but this was my emergency hope, small and hard and full of possibility. I tucked a photograph of Raymond holding baby Daniel under a backyard peach tree into my wallet, the edges worn soft from years of secret glances during long bus rides or sleepless nights. Raymond's smile crooked from the missing tooth he never fixed because the dentist was too expensive.
Savannah smelled of salt and river mud, the air thick enough to chew,
and the workshop greenhouse was a cathedral of glass and green, condensation dripping from the rafters like slow rain, the floor slick with moss and spilled potting mix. I learned to graft citrus by slicing scions with a blade sharper than any kitchen knife I owned, to coax orchids from bark using sphagnum moss I had gathered myself from a cypress knee, to press sea lavender so thin it became translucent, the petals glowing like stained glass when held to the light. The other women were widows and empty nesters too, their hands mapping stories and calluses and age spots, their laughter echoing off the glass as we shared coffee from a communal pot that tasted of rust and chicory. For the first time in decades, I spoke without measuring whether my words would embarrass someone else, my voice growing stronger with each story of raising Daniel on WIC vouchers and still managing annuals and coffee cans, of the moonflower that bloomed only one night a year and was worth every midnight vigil when I sat on the back steps with a flashlight watching the buds swell like promises. On the third evening, the instructor, a retired botanist named Marisol with silver braids and a voice like riverstones, asked us to pair up and design a living frame for the courtyard, a structure that would tell our stories in leaves and stems. My partner was Evelyn, 71, who had spent 40 years arranging flowers for debutante balls in Charleston, her fingers still remembering the weight of gardenias and camellias, and now wanted something that would outlive her, something that would not wilt when the last guest left the party. We chose the moonflower vine I had carried from Atlanta, its roots wrapped in a damp towel that smelled of home, training it up a wire arch laced with Spanish moss that Evelyn had harvested from her own oak trees, the moss gray and ghostly in the humidity. We worked in silence at first, then with stories. Evelyn telling of the debutante who had fainted into the punch bowl, me speaking of the night Daniel learned to ride a bike on this very street, his knees scraped raw, but his grin whiter than the moon. When the final evening arrived, the entire workshop gathered beneath it as the buds unfurled in perfect sequence, a slow-motion waterfall of white, the fragrance rising like incense, drawing moths and memories. Someone took a picture with a phone that flashed like lightning. Someone else posted it to the workshop page with fingers still green from chlorophyll. And by the time I boarded the bus home, the image had been shared to a local garden club with the caption, "Masterpiece by Florence of Atlanta, age 67, first public display," the words glowing on the screen like the flowers themselves. I saved the notification on my flip phone, the first time I had ever done such a thing, my thumb hovering over the save button as if pressing a pedal. On the ride back, I watched the landscape shift from marsh to pine to red clay, the bus rattling over potholes that reminded me of home, and I realized I was not counting the hours until I could call Daniel, my mind instead on the feel of the vine in my hands, the way it had climbed toward light despite the journey. I bought a bag of boiled peanuts from a roadside stand where an old man in overalls counted change with fingers gnarled like mine, and ate them slowly, letting the salt sting my lips, tasting freedom in every bite, the shells cracking open like small revelations. I pressed one peanut shell between the pages of my notebook, a small souvenir of the day I chose myself, the texture rough against the paper, like the truth I was finally facing. I wrote a single line beneath it, "Day 1 of the rest of my life," and underlined it until the pen tore the paper, the tear a small wound that would heal into a scar of strength. Back on Lyndhurst Drive, the porch looked naked without its usual riot of color, the empty pots like accusations. So I began again, this time for myself, rolling up the sleeves of my old work shirt until the elbow shone white. I claimed the side yard the city had ignored for years, the strip between my house and the chain-link fence where weeds had grown taller than my waist, their seeds carried by wind and neglect. I hauled in compost from the community pile behind the rec center, the smell rich and earthy. Borrowed a tiller from Mr. Delgado, who insisted on showing me how to start it 3 times, and planted a heritage garden. Moonflowers from the seeds I had saved since Baniel was small, 4 o'clocks that opened at dusk like clockwork, heirloom zinnias my mother had grown during the Depression and rose between the corn, and a row of okra because Raymond had loved it fried crisp with cornmeal and hot sauce, the pods fuzzy reminders of his calloused hands. Children from the block wandered over, drawn by the smell of turned earth and the sound of my humming, old spirituals my grandmother sang while shelling peas. And soon I was teaching them to press petals between wax paper, to sell simple frames at the Saturday market for pocket money they could spend on ice cream or comic books. 10-year-old Jamal became my shadow, his sneakers always untied, asking questions faster than I could answer. Why do moonflowers only open at night? How do you know when a seed is ready? And when his grandmother complained he was underfoot, I invited her to sit on the porch glider and drink sweet tea while we worked, the glider creaking under our combined weight like an old friend. I stopped answering Daniel's calls on the first ring, letting them go to the voicemail that still held Raymond's voice from 2005, a message about picking up milk. When he finally came by unannounced, 3 weeks after Savannah, his luxury sedan looking out of place among the potholes, he stood in the driveway staring at the new garden as if it had grown overnight, the arch of moonflowers already climbing the trellis I had built from scrap lumber. "Mom, this is incredible. Why didn't you tell me you were doing all this?" His voice carrying the same wonder he had shown at age 6 when I grew a tomato in a bucket. I was wiping soil from my hands onto an apron I had sewn from feed sacks, the stitches uneven but strong, and I smiled and answered, "I was waiting to see if you would notice without being told," the words tasting like the truth I had swallowed for years. Claire stepped out of the car behind him, her heels sinking into the soft earth, eyes wide at the arch of moonflowers now tall enough to walk beneath, her manicured fingers brushing a petal as if testing whether it was real, the white glow catching the gold of her wedding ring. Daniel asked if I could consult on a rooftop project uptown, something sustainable, something that tells a story, his voice eager like when he was small and wanted to build forts from couch cushions. And I said I would consider it, but my rates had changed, the words coming out steadier than I felt. He blinked, then laughed the way he used to when I threatened to charge him for extra pancakes on Saturday mornings. "Name your price," he said, and I named it. Double what the corporate designers quoted, because my time had finally learned its worth, the number rolling off my tongue like a seed I had been saving. Claire opened her mouth as if to protest, her lips painted the same coral as the wedding invitations, then closed it, watching Jamal carry a flat of marigolds like a waiter balancing a tray, his tongue sticking out in concentration. That night I sat on the porch steps, the wood warm from the day's sun, and wrote a list in the spiral notebook I had bought at the dollar store for 25 cents. No family errands, no emergency favors, just things I wanted. Learned Spanish moss basket weaving from the Gula women at the market. Visit the Callaway Gardens azalea bowl in spring when the colors hurt the eyes. Teach a children's pressing class at the library, where I had once checked out books on parenting alone. I underlined the last one twice, the pen digging into the paper. I added another line. Buy a real camera to document the garden, one with a zoom lens to catch the detail of a petal's vein, and underlined that one 3 times. I wrote one more. Start a savings account with my name only, no joint anything, and drew a small moonflower beside it, its petals shaded with the stub of a pencil. Then I added, take a pottery class, because the feel of wet clay under my nails reminded me of the day I painted the moonflower pot in the community center, the instructor praising my steady hand, and I had never stopped missing that sensation of creation. I wrote one final line, write my own story, no more footnotes in someone else's life, and circled it and read. The circle, imperfect, but complete. 2 months later, the Southside Heritage Garden became a stop on the Atlanta Black History Tour. school buses unloading children who ran between the beds with sneakers flashing red from the clay, while I explained how every flower carried a memory of someone who had refused to stay buried, my voice carrying over the hum of bees and the rustle of leaves. The tour guide, a college student named Keisha, with braids that swung like pendulums, asked if I would speak at the library senior program, her eyes bright with the kind of hope I had once carried, and I said yes before fear could catch me, my heart pounding like it did the first time I sold a frame to a stranger. On the day of the talk, I wore the pale green dress, now faded but clean, the hem let out twice to accommodate the weight I had lost, then gained, then lost again, and stood beneath a projector showing slides of my moonflower arch, the images glowing on the screen like stained glass. 30 seniors listened as I told them about the wedding, the storm, the silence I had chosen, and how a single wine could teach you to bloom where you are planted. Their faces a map of wrinkles and wisdom, some nodding, some tearing up at the parts about sacrifice. Mrs. Delgado cried into her tissue, the same one she had used at Raymond's funeral. And afterward, a woman named Beatrice asked if I could help her start a memory garden for her late husband, her hands trembling as she showed me a photograph of him holding a single rose. I said I would, but only if she promised to charge for her time too, the word surprising even me. She laughed, surprised, and said she had never thought of herself as having anything worth charging for, her voice cracking on the last word. I told her to start with the price of her dignity, and she wrote it down on the back of a grocery receipt. A man in the back row, Mr. Hargrove, 92 and sharp as winter frost, his cane tapping the floor like a metronome, asked if I could press the last rose from his wife's funeral, the one he had kept in his Bible for 15 years, its petals brown but intact. I said yes, and when I handed him the finished frame 2 weeks later, the rose floating between glass like a ghost, he pressed a $20 bill into my palm, his hand shaking, and said, "Worth every penny to see her smile preserved," his eyes wet behind thick glasses. He returned the next month with a photograph of his wife at 20, laughing in a sunflower field, her hair wild with wind, and asked if I could recreate the scene in pressed petals, his voice breaking on the word recreate. I spent 3 evenings matching colors from my dye garden, boiling marigold petals for yellow, indigo for shadow, and when I unveiled the portrait in the library meeting room, he wept openly, then insisted on paying double, pressing 2 20s into my hand like communion wafers. The following spring, I traveled to Callaway Gardens with Beatrice and Mrs. Delgado, 3 widows in a rented minivan that smelled of peppermint gum and garden soil, laughing so hard at roadside diners that the waitress asked if we were sisters, her name tag reading Darlene in cursive script. We walked the azalea trails until our feet ached, the paths carpeted in pink and coral, took photographs with my new camera, a Canon I had bought from the money from Mr. Hargrove's portrait, and bought matching sun hats that made us look like a girl group from the 60s, the brims floppy and forgiving. At a craft fair in Pine Mountain, I signed up for the pottery class on a whim, the booth manned by a woman with clay under her nails and a smile that said she understood, spending 3 Saturdays learning to center clay on a wheel that spun like the years I had let slip through my fingers, the clay slapping wet and cool against my palms. My first bowl cracked in the kiln, a hairline fracture like the one in my wedding portrait, but the second held water without a drip, and I glazed it the pale green of my wedding dress, planting a moonflower cutting in it as a promise to keep trying, the cutting taking root in the glaze like hope in hardship. I taught my first paid children's workshop at the library, 20 small hands pressing pansies, while I told them stories of flowers that bloomed in concrete cracks, their eyes wide as saucers, one little girl asking if flowers could grow on the moon. Jamon's grandmother started selling her own frames at the market, pricing them higher than mine, her hand steadier now that arthritis medicine was covered by her new part-time job. And when I teased her, she said, "Florence taught me I'm worth it," her voice carrying the same pride I felt when Daniel aced his first spelling test. Daniel's rooftop project won an award, the ceremony held in a glass-walled atrium that smelled of money and ambition, and in his acceptance speech, he thanked the woman who showed him that design begins in the soil, not the software,
his voice cracking on the word soil, and the camera panned to me in the audience, wearing a new linen jacket the color of young leaves, the jacket bought for my first corporate consulting check. Claire sent me a text afterward, a single line. "I ordered your moonflower necklace for my mother. She cried when she saw it." The words glowing on my phone like a small forgiveness.
I saved the message, then turned my phone face down and went back to pruning the okra, the leaves rustling like whispers. I fired my first successful teapot in the community kiln, its spout shaped like a moonflower petal, the curve perfect after 3 failed attempts, and sold it at the market for $50, more than I had ever charged for a frame, the buyer a chef who wanted it for her restaurant's herbal tea service. A collector from Buckhead bought it on the spot, then commissioned a dinner set for 12, each plate with a different pressed herb sealed beneath the glaze, the commission paying for the new greenhouse roof I had dreamed of for years. 1 year to the day after the wedding storm, I hosted the first annual Moonflower Night in the Heritage Garden, the air thick with anticipation and the smell of turned earth. Neighbors brought folding chairs that creaked under their weight. Children carried lanterns made from pressed flower jars that glowed like fireflies. And the local news crew filmed as the vines opened in perfect synchronization, the cameraman whispering, "Wow," under his breath. Daniel and Claire arrived early, helping string lights without being asked, their hands brushing as they worked. And when the buds began to unfurl, Daniel took the microphone from the MC, a local radio host with a voice like honey, and said, "My mother taught me that some things are worth waiting for, even if they only bloom 1 night a year," his eyes finding mine across the crowd. The crowd applauded, but I was watching Jamal hand a pressed daisy frame to a little girl who had never seen a real flower before, her face lighting up like the lanterns. And I knew the real applause was in that small exchange, the way her fingers traced the petals as if they were gold. Later, when the last petal drifted to the ground like a pale moth, Daniel walked me home under streetlights that flickered like fireflies, the night air cool against my skin. "Mom," he said, "I keep thinking about that dance we never had at the wedding," his voice soft with regret. I stopped on the sidewalk, took his hand, and we swayed to the distant hum of cicadas. No music but the night itself, his shoulder broader than I remembered. When we reached my gate, he hugged me longer than he had since childhood, his cologne mixing with the garden scent, and I felt the years settle into place, not as burdens, but as layers of rich compost feeding something new. He noticed the new teapot on the porch table, lifted it carefully as if it were fragile as the flowers, and asked if I had made it, his fingers tracing the spout. When I nodded, he traced the moonflower spout with one finger and said, "This is better than anything in our showroom," his voice carrying the same awe he had shown when I built him a treehouse from pallets. Claire lingered by the gate, holding a small box wrapped in brown paper, and when Daniel stepped inside to use the bathroom, she handed it to me, a replacement frame for the wedding portrait, walnut with hand-carved vines that curled like the real ones. "I'm sorry it took so long," she whispered, her eyes meeting mine without flinching. And for the first time, her smile reached her eyes, crinkling at the corners like Raymond's used to. The second spring, I expanded the garden to include a teaching plot behind the church, the soil blessed by the pastor who had married Raymond and me. Funded by a grant I wrote myself after taking a night class on proposal writing at the community center, the instructor a former social worker who understood the language of need. I hired Jamal as my official assistant, paying him $10 an hour to haul mulch and label seeds with a Sharpie that smelled of chemicals. And his mother cried when she saw his first paycheck, hugging me so hard my ribs creaked. I began selling limited edition pressed flower journals at the Piedmont Park Farmers Market, each cover a different season of the Heritage Garden, the paper recycled from the library's discarded books, and they sold out before noon, customers lining up with canvas bags and questions.
Claire surprised me by reserving a booth for her interior design clients, displaying my journals alongside her mood boards of reclaimed wood and neutral tones. And when a magazine featured the collaboration, she insisted my name appear first, the headline reading, Florence Whitfield and Claire Whitfield, Rooted in Beauty. Daniel framed the article and hung it in his office, right beside his architecture degree, the glass reflecting his pride. I added a pottery shelf to my market table, selling cups and bowls glazed in moonflower white, the clays sourced from a quarry in North Georgia, and children begged their parents for the ones with tiny pressed petals sealed inside the clay, their fingers sticky with kettle corn. A local restaurant commissioned a wall installation of pressed okra blossoms in resin, the pods sliced thin to show their star-shaped hearts. And when it was unveiled, the chef credited me in the menu footnotes. Florence Whitfield, the woman who taught Atlanta to taste its history. The words printed beside the collard green special. On my 68th birthday, I woke to find the porch transformed, the fairy lights strung through the moonflower arch like constellations, a table set with a cloth I recognized as one I had pressed violets on decades ago, the stains faint but permanent. A breakfast of biscuits flaky with lard, peach jam from the tree in the backyard, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead, steam rising in the morning air. Daniel, Claire, Jamal, Beatrice, Mrs. Delgado, and half the neighborhood stood waiting with party hats made from pressed leaves, their voices a chorus of off-key happy birthday. Daniel handed me a gift wrapped in brown paper. Inside was the original moonflower pot, now glazed in deep cobalt with my name painted in gold cursive, and a note in Daniel's neat print, interest on 30 years of love. Thank you for teaching us how to grow. I cried, but only a little, because the coffee was perfect and the biscuits were still warm, the jam sweet with summer. Jamal gave me a card he had illustrated with crayon moonflowers, the colors bleeding outside the lines. And inside, he had written in careful block letters, "Thank you for teaching me that dirt is just future flowers," his spelling of future with an extra E. Claire presented a cake frosted with edible pressed pansies, each one a perfect replica of the first workshop batch, the layers alternating lemon and lavender. And when I cut the first slice, she whispered, "I finally learned the shortbread recipe, gluten-free, and it's in the frosting," her breath warm against my ear. Beatrice unveiled a quilt stitched from garden scraps, each square a pressed flower from a different season, the stitches tiny and even, and Mrs. Delgado played a recording of Raymond's favorite song on her old transistor radio, the one she had carried since 1963, the crackle of static adding to the melody.
That fall, I flew to Charleston for the first time, not on a bus, but on a plane ticket Daniel insisted on buying, the seat belt tight across my lap as we lifted above the clouds. I attended a National Heritage Garden Conference where I was a keynote speaker, the ballroom filled with people who smelled of greenhouse and ambition, and I wore the linen jacket and carried a portfolio of photographs taken with my camera, the images sharp enough to count the veins on a petal. When I stepped off the stage to applause that echoed like rain on a tin roof, I realized I was no longer introducing myself as Daniel's mother. I was Florence Whitfield, master preserver, teacher, designer of living memory, the words tasting like the first peach of summer. On the plane home, I sketched plans for a traveling pressed flower exhibit, something that could visit schools and senior centers, something that would carry the story of the moonflower to children who had never seen their grandmother's garden, the sketches filling the margins of the airline magazine. I titled it Roots and Wings because that was what I had finally given myself, the wings earned through roots deep in pain and perseverance. I added a mobile pottery wheel to the exhibit design, imagining children throwing their first pots while petals dried beside them, the clay spinning like the world. A museum curator approached me in the airport, her suitcase covered in stickers from botanical gardens worldwide.
asking to borrow the original moonflower pot for a folk art exhibit. And I agreed on the condition that it returned in time for the next moonlight night, the pot traveling in a crate lined with the same moss I had used to wrap it years ago. 2 years after the wedding storm, the Southside Heritage Garden had its own nonprofit status, the paperwork filed by a lawyer who had once bought a frame for his mother, a website Jamal designed in his computer class using code he learned from library books, and a waiting list for children's workshops that stretched into the next school year. I hired Beatrice as co-director, paid her the same rate I charged corporate clients, her eyes widening at the check, and together we trained a dozen neighborhood women to lead tours, their voices growing stronger with each retelling of the garden's origin. Daniel's firm donated a greenhouse kit, the panels arriving on a flatbed truck that blocked the street for hours, and Claire organized the fundraising gala, wearing the moonflower necklace her mother had never taken off, the petals sealed in resin that caught the light like dew. The local university offered me an adjunct position teaching botanical arts to education majors, the dean citing my work with children as revolutionary. And I accepted on the condition that my students spend one Saturday a month in the garden with the children, their manicured hands soon as dirty as mine. My first class included Jamal, now 13 and taller than me, who corrected my Latin names with a grin that showed braces, and I pretended to be annoyed, but secretly I was proud, seeing in him the same curiosity I had nurtured in Daniel. I brought my travel kiln to campus, firing student pots in the parking lot while parents waited in minivans, the smell of clay and glaze drifting through open windows like incense. One parent asked if I offered adult classes. One student, a shy girl named Maya, with hair twisted into a bun held by a pencil, created a series of plates illustrating her grandmother's migration story in pressed marigolds and indigo, the colors vivid against the white clay. And when the set won a statewide art prize, she dedicated it to the woman who taught her that roots could travel, her voice shaking as she read my name. 5 years after the storm, on the night of the garden's first moonlight wedding, a young couple who had met in my children's workshop pressing daisies side by side, I stood beneath the arch in a new dress the color of moonflower petals, the fabric flowing like water, and watched them exchange vows written on pressed leaf paper, the words inked in berry juice that stained their fingers purple. Daniel stood beside me, no longer the distracted groom, but a man who knew the weight of every word, his hand steady on my arm. And when the couple asked me to bless their rings, I placed a moonflower seed in each of their palms and said, "May you remember that love, like this seed, needs darkness to germinate, but once it breaks through, it will climb toward light no matter the obstacle," my voice carrying over the hush of the crowd. The crowd was silent except for the rustle of leaves and the soft sob of the bride's mother, and I felt Raymond's hand on my shoulder, or maybe it was just the wind, but either way, I was not alone, the night wrapping around us like a shawl. The bride's grandmother, a woman I had taught to press her own wedding violets 50 years earlier in a church basement that smelled of floor wax, caught the bouquet of moonflowers and pressed it to her cheek like a lost child, her tears falling onto the petals. She later mailed me the dried petals with a note in spidery handwriting, "You gave me back my wedding night," and I pressed them into a frame that hung in the visitor center for decades, the glass fogging slightly in summer humidity. The garden grew beyond the fence line, spilling into the vacant lot next door after the city granted me a community land trust, the paperwork signed in a ceremony under the peach tree, the mayor's pen scratching like a beetle. I planted a memory grove of dogwoods, one for every elder who had shared a story in my workshops, their names carved into small plaques at the base, and beneath each tree I buried a pressed flower from their childhood, the soil dark and rich. Beatrice's tree held a faded zinnia from her wedding bouquet, the petals still pink after 60 years. Mrs. Delgado's a pansy her mother grew in a coffee can during the war, the purple vivid against the white trunk. Jamal planted a redbud for his great-grandmother, the seed from a pod he had carried in his pocket for months. And when it bloomed purple in spring, he brought his classmates to see it, explaining how trees remember people the way photographs remember smiles, his voice confident like a tour guide. I added a pottery pavilion, a low brick structure with a kiln I fired with garden prunings, the smoke curling into the sky like prayers, where visitors could throw pots while waiting for moonflowers to open, the wheel spinning under small hands that left clay on their clothes like badges. A sculpture in residence program began. Artists living in a tiny house built from recycled shipping containers painted the color of moonflowers, their work inspired by the garden's cycles of decay and rebirth. One created a series of vessels that held water only at night. 10 years after the storm, at 77, I published my first book, Moonflowers in Concrete, a collection of essays and pressed flower plates printed on paper made from garden clippings that sold out its first printing in a week, the bookstore calling for a second before the ink was dry.
The launch party was held in the garden, tables set beneath the original arch, now reinforced with ironwood and draped in lights that twinkled like stars, the air thick with fragrance and laughter. Daniel read the dedication aloud. To every woman who was told her story was too small to matter, may you grow wild and tall. His voice steady but emotional. Claire serving lavender shortbread, gluten-free, and passing out copies of the recipe on cards illustrated with my moonflowers, the cards tucked into books like bookmarks. Jamal, now a college freshman studying landscape architecture on the scholarship I had helped him apply for, the application essays written under my porch light, gave a speech about the grandmother he never met but learned to know through the garden she inspired, his voice cracking on the word inspired. I stood at the back, wearing the same pale green dress now patched at the hem with moonflower fabric, the patches sewn with thread dyed from blackberries, and let the applause wash over me like summer rain, the sound mingling with the rustle of leaves. A literary agent approached afterward, her business card crisp, asking about a children's version, and I agreed on the spot, sketching picture book spreads on napkins while the party continued, the napkins later framed in the visitor center. The children's book, Little Moon and the Storm Seed, became a classroom staple, translated into 12 languages, including Swahili and Mandarin, with proceeds funding garden scholarships for children who had never touched soil. On quiet mornings, I still rose before dawn, the habit etched into my bones, but now I walk the garden paths with a thermos of coffee gone lukewarm, checking the moonflowers for buds that swelled like promises, greeting the volunteers who arrived with seedlings in yogurt containers and stories in their eyes. I kept a guest book by the gate where visitors wrote what the garden had taught them, the pages filling with handwriting in English and Spanish and Vietnamese, children scrawl in elders' careful cursive, some entries accompanied by doodles of flowers. One entry in Daniel's neat architect's print read, "I thought success meant leaving the soil behind, but Mom showed me the view is better from the roots, the ink blue like the glaze on the moonflower pot." Claire added beneath it, "And the flowers smell sweeter when you remember who planted them," her handwriting looping like vines. Luna, at 5, drew a stick figure grandmother with a watering can taller than her head and wrote in wobbly letters, "Gamma makes magic," the A's backward but earnest. A visitor from Japan left a haiku pressed between rice paper. "Moonflower opens, grandmother's heart unfolds, night remembers day," the paper thin as the petals themselves. 15 years after the wedding, the Southside Heritage Garden was named a National Historic Site, the first in Atlanta dedicated to a living woman's work. The ceremony broadcast on local news with a reporter who mispronounced my name until I corrected her gently. The ceremony drew television crews and the mayor, his suit crisp despite the heat. But I spent most of it in the children's plot, showing a new group how to press their first pansy, their fingers sticky with excitement. Daniel and Claire, now parents to a daughter named Luna, who carried moonflower seeds in her pocket like treasure, the seeds rattling when she ran, stood on the stage while I knelt in the dirt because that was where I belonged, the soil cool under my knees. When the mayor asked me to say a few words, his tie patterned with magnolias,
I walked to the microphone with soil on my knees and said, "This garden is not mine. It belongs to every hand that ever turned its earth, every heart that ever needed reminding that beauty can grow anywhere if you give it time and light," my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. Then I stepped down and let Luna cut the ribbon with garden shears almost as big as she was, her tongue sticking out in concentration. The plaque read, "Florence Whitfield Heritage Garden, established 2015, where roots teach wings to fly," the letters engraved deep enough to last centuries. The dedication included a QR code linking to an audio tour in 7 languages, narrated by former workshop children who had grown into poets and scientists and teachers, their voices overlapping like generations. 20 years after the storm, at 87, I sat on the porch glider that had been moved to the center of the garden, the wood worn smooth by countless hands, surrounded by moonflowers that now climbed a pergola large enough to shade a wedding, the beams carved with quotes from my book. My hands were gnarled but steady as I pressed a final petal between wax paper, the paper yellowed with age, a gift for the newest volunteer, a teenage girl who reminded me of myself at 14, dreaming in the margins of library books, her hair in twists that caught the light. Daniel arrived with Luna, now 15 and taller than her grandmother, carrying a tray of peach ice cream made from the tree I had planted the year she was born, the peaches small but sweet. Claire followed with a scrapbook of every article, every photograph, every child's drawing the garden had inspired, the pages thick with memory. They sat beside me, and Luna opened to a page showing the original moonflower pot, now cracked but still blooming in the greenhouse, and read aloud the inscription I had added years ago. "From a storm to a legacy, thank you for teaching me to grow," her voice clear as a bell. She turned to the last page, a photograph of the 3 generations beneath the arch, and added her own note in purple ink. "And thank you for teaching me to keep growing," the ink still wet. She revealed her college acceptance letter, landscape architecture with a minor in botanical arts, the envelope creased from being carried in her pocket, and asked that I would design her dorm window box, her eyes shining with the same hope I had seen in Daniel at her age. That night the moonflowers opened in waves, hundreds of them, more than I could count, the fragrance rising like a tide, and the garden filled with neighbors and strangers and children who had grown up under its leaves, their faces lit by lantern and moonlight. Someone played a recording of Raymond's favorite song on a portable speaker, the notes slightly warped but true, and Daniel asked me to dance one last time, his hand warm in mine. We moved slowly beneath the arch, my feet remembering steps his had forgotten, the wood creaking under our weight. And when the final bud unfurled, he whispered, "Mom, I finally understand what you meant about the darkness," his breath warm against my ear. I rested my head on his shoulder, smelling soil and cologne and the sweet night air of a life fully lived, and answered, "The darkness is just the place where roots learn their strength," the words of benediction.
Luna joined us, slipping her hand into mine, her fingers long and strong, and Claire took a photograph that would hang in the visitor center for decades, the image capturing 3 generations in a single frame. A drone captured the scene from above, the pergola a white galaxy against the dark, and the footage went viral, inspiring copycat moonflower plantings in cities across the country, from Detroit to Dhaka. 25 years after the storm, the garden hosted its first international exchange, students from a sister city in Ghana arriving to learn pressed flower techniques and teach baobab propagation, their luggage filled with seeds and stories. I was 92, moving slower but still rising before dawn, my cane carved from the peach tree that had died in a drought. And I sat in the pottery pavilion while a girl named Amina showed me how to shape clay with cowrie shells. Her laughter bright as morning glories, the shells clicking like castanets. Jamal, now 35 and lead architect on urban green spaces across the Southeast, video called from a project in Savannah to introduce his own daughter, Flora, named for the grandmother she called Gigi Flo, her face filling the screen with Jamal's eyes. The garden had satellite plots in 3 counties, each with its own moonflower arch built to my specifications, and every summer solstice they opened in synchronized bloom, tracked by an app Luna had coded in high school.
the app pinging with notifications from around the world. The app included a feature where users could upload photographs of their own moonflowers, creating a global map of night-blooming hope, the dots glowing like constellations. 30 years after the wedding, at 97, I celebrated my birthday with a quiet dawn ceremony, just me and the moonflowers and a thermos of coffee gone cold, the steam long vanished. My hands trembled as I pressed one perfect bloom between glass plates, the glass cool against my fingers, a gift for the garden's archives. And I whispered to the vine the way I once whispered to Daniel when he had nightmares. "You are enough, just as you are," my voice a thread connecting past and future. Daniel arrived later with great-grandchildren who scattered moonflower seeds like confetti, their laughter echoing off the pergola. And Claire read from the children's book I had finally published, the one with illustrations of a grandmother who grew a forest from a single storm, her voice steady despite the years. The final page showed the original pot, cracked but overflowing, and the words, "Some storms come to wash away what no longer serves, so new roots can find their way." The illustration showing a tiny seed in dark soil. Flora, age 7, asked if she could plant the pressed flower, her hands already dirty, and I showed her how to tuck it beneath the soil like a secret, explaining that even flat things can grow if given earth and time, her eyes wide as the moonflowers. 35 years after the storm, the garden launched a seed bank, collecting heirloom varieties from elders' attics and basements, each packet labeled with the donor's story in their own handwriting. The packets stored in a climate-controlled vault beneath the visitor center. I was 102, living in a cottage built on the garden's edge, its windows facing the moonflower pergola, so I could watch the nightly opening from my bed, the blooms glowing like ghosts. My great-great-grandchildren visited every Sunday, bringing drawings and questions about the flowers that only opened when they slept, and I taught them to press petals between the pages of the original Moonflowers in Concrete, now battered but treasured, the spine cracked from love. Jamal, gray but strong, maintained the irrigation system he had designed pro bono, the pipes humming like a heartbeat, and Claire curated the visitor center exhibits, rotating new pressed flower installations every season, her hands steady despite arthritis. Luna, now a professor, brought her students to study the garden's soil microbiology, discovering a new beneficial fungus they named Floracia whitfieldii in my honor, the name printed in a journal I could no longer read without glasses. 40 years after the wedding, the garden became a UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage Site, recognized for preserving the living art of pressed flower storytelling, the designation announced in a ceremony attended by diplomats who mispronounced moonflower until Luna corrected them. I was 107, frail but lucid, my mind sharp as the blade I once used to graft citrus, and watched the ceremony on a tablet Jamal's grandson held steady, the screen reflecting my wrinkled face. The delegate read a proclamation in 5 languages, the words rolling like thunder, then asked if the founder had a message. With assistance, I stood beneath the pergola, now supported by grandson-grown oak beams carved with moonflower motifs, and said, "Tell them the garden was never about the flowers. It was about the hands that planted them, the hearts that believed they could grow, and the stories that refused to stay pressed between pages, my voice thin but clear." The crowd, thousands strong, fell silent as the moonflowers began their evening unfurling, a white wave rolling across 40 years of cultivated hope, the fragrance rising like a benediction. Inside, the house smelled of moonflower and possibility, the scent seeping through the open windows. And for the first time, I left the porch light on, not for expected visitors, but because I liked the way it lit the path to my own door, the bulb warm and steady. The crooked wedding portrait had been reframed in walnut, paid for by the first check from my teaching salary, and it hung straight now, Raymond and me forever young under a veil of dried baby's breath, the crack in the glass mended with gold in the kintsugi style a Japanese artist in residence had taught me. I kept a small pressed moonflower from the wedding night in a locket around my neck, the chain thin but unbreakable, not as a reminder of pain, but as a proof that even crushed things can be made beautiful again, the petal fragile but eternal. And every year on the anniversary of the storm, I opened the locket, let the fragile petal catch the breeze, and watched it drift back to the garden where it belonged. Another seed in the soil of a life I had finally learned to tend for myself, the petal landing on soil turned by hands I would never know. The garden had outgrown its fences, its stories, its founder, but it carried my name in every leaf, every petal, every child who pressed a flower and learned that beauty could rise from ruin, and that was enough. On my 100th birthday, the city renamed Lyndhurst Drive Florence Whitfield Way, and the street signs bloomed with pressed moonflowers sealed in resin, a permanent reminder that some women do not fade, they root deeper, reach higher, and teach the world to bloom long after they are gone. 50 years after the storm, the moonflowers still opened on cue, guided by generations who had learned from a woman who once arrived late to a wedding, carrying nothing but a pot and a heart ready to grow. The blooms a living testament to the power of storms to clear the way for new growth.
Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect,